Why do people willingly shut the hatch behind them and enter a steel tube where there is no sun, no fresh air, and no room for error? Today you will learn how submarines went from cramped, deadly boxes to nuclear monsters that can live underwater for months, and why the most frightening part of this story is not the missiles, but what happens to the person inside. Humanity never built them as comfortable transport. From the very start, they were a dangerous experiment on the edge of madness. The first submarines were not sea predators, but cramped, airless metal boxes in which people tested the limits of fear and endurance. They were slow, unreliable, and often dangerous even without an enemy. And inside them, a person first understood that underwater, the main opponent might not be a hostile fleet, but the environment itself. Air ran out quickly, machinery failed, the body grew exhausted from dampness, and the mind began to work in a different way. Because underwater, time itself changes. You no longer live by an ordinary day. You live by waiting, by the groan of the hull, by footsteps in a narrow compartment, and by the feeling that the ocean above you presses not only on the metal, but on your mind. Yet it was inside those primitive machines that the idea was born that later changed war, the ability to disappear. A surface ship can be seen, heard, and tracked, but from the start, the submarine gave militaries the privilege of remaining unseen. That is why the evolution of submarines moved so fast. First came improvised designs, then diesel boats appeared, then the world wars began, and the submarine fleet became a threat to trade routes, navies, and whole countries. But here is what matters. The more advanced the submarine became, the harsher life inside it became as well. On older boats, sailors lived almost like men inside a besieged fortress. So even if a submarine looked like an engineering breakthrough from the outside, inside it remained a school of survival. This is why the story of submarines grips people so strongly. It is not just a story about technology. It is a story about how human beings chose to descend into an alien environment and turn fear into a weapon. And the deeper the boat went, the clearer it became that there would be no road back to normal war. But the true turning point came when the submarine stopped being merely a ship that could dive and became an autonomous underwater world. That is where the atomic age begins. Before that, boats could hide, attack, and keep the enemy under pressure, but they still depended on the surface. They had to come up, recharge batteries, refresh the air, and risk exposing themselves. The nuclear submarine broke that dependence and turned underwater warfare into a different game. Now the boat could spend weeks, and sometimes longer, living almost like a separate civilization underwater. At that moment, the submarine changed from a weapon of sudden attack into a symbol of constant hidden threat. It was no longer simply hunting, it was present. You could not see it, did not know where it was, did not understand how close it might be, and yet you were forced to build strategy around it. That is why nuclear boats became one of the most frightening things in modern military history. They changed the logic of fear. Now danger could come not from the sky and not from the land, but from the silent depth. And together with that power, the person inside the machine changed too. Old submariners fought cramped space and unreliable technology. Modern crews live inside a complex mechanism that gives them enormous power but demands almost flawless discipline. Think about it. Under the water, there is a real city in motion, only without streets, windows, sunlight, or the right to simply step outside. You are inside a weapon that can destroy ships, gather intelligence, escort carriers, launch missiles, and still remain almost invisible. But the price of that power is very high. Service on a submarine breaks your normal sense of time, space, and even yourself. And here is a question for the viewer. Could you survive even 1 month inside a steel tube without daylight, without ordinary silence, without fresh air, and without the chance to be alone for even 10 minutes? Write honestly in the comments whether you could endure that kind of service, or whether by the second week you would already be talking to the bulkhead like an old friend. And if you like stories where technology, psychology, and military reality are woven into one narrative, then you already understand that subscribing here is not a formality, but the way to avoid missing the next pieces. Because from here, everything only gets harsher. The power of the submarine is impressive, but life inside it can be more frightening than any movie. The strongest contrast begins when people on the outside admire a submarine as the peak of technology, while we look inside and see not a futuristic palace, but a cramped, noisy, functional organism in which everything serves survival and mission. In a new nuclear boat, there is no extra space because every meter is given over to the reactor, life support systems, electronics, weapons, cables, pipelines, stores, mechanisms, and workstations. A person literally lives inside the logic of the machine. You sleep not when you want, but when the watch allows it. You eat not when hunger arrives, but when a slot opens. Day and night are erased, because beyond the hull there is always the same darkness. And inside, the light is regulated, not by the sun, but by the rhythm of duty. That is why new submarines affect people more deeply than most assume. They teach a crew to exist in conditions where personal boundaries almost dissolve. In normal life, a person needs some corner where they can be alone. On a submarine, that is almost a luxury. And still, people adapt. They develop a special psychology, a special humor, even a special calm. A submariner knows that panic is useless here, because underwater there is nowhere to run. That is why what matters most on a boat is not loud heroes, but composed people who can hold the rhythm. Yet the weapons around them never stop pressing on the mind. Torpedoes, missiles, the reactor, combat stations, alarms, the constant background hum of danger. All of that creates a sensation of living on the edge. You drink tea, and in the next compartment, there may be a system on which not only the mission, but the life of the entire crew depends. You lie down to sleep, and above you there is a mass of water and a hull that cannot be allowed to weaken for even a second. And this is where one of the strongest hooks in the whole subject is hidden. A submarine does not merely carry weapons, it forces people to live in constant proximity to weapons as part of everyday life. For a civilian, war begins somewhere far away, after alarming headlines. For a submariner, war, the possibility of war, and preparation for war are built directly into daily routine. That is why a submarine affects a person not only through fear, but through a special professional fatalism. If you serve here, then you accept it in advance that safety is never complete. And that is what makes submarine service elite, hard, and psychologically very expensive all at once. But inside, everything depends on whether a human being can endure one more watch, one more alarm, one more day without sunlight, and one more descent into a world where mistakes are not discussed, but paid for at once. And here is the main conclusion that makes the story of submarines perfect for a long YouTube narrative. A submarine is not just technology of the past or a weapon of the future. It is a mirror of how far a person is willing to go for power, control, and survival. From the first primitive diving machines, in which people fought water and fear almost by feel, to modern atomic giants capable of living underwater for months and carrying destructive force, the path of the submarine fleet looks like a triumph of engineering. But if you dig deeper, it is also a story about the price of that triumph. Every new technology on a submarine made it stronger, but did not make the human being inside it any less vulnerable. Quite the opposite. The more powerful the boat, the greater the responsibility, the heavier the psychological pressure, and the more terrifying the consequences of even a small mistake. That is why submarines affect people so strongly. They erase the familiar world and replace it with an artificial one, where air is controlled, sleep is broken into watches, space is compressed, and silence becomes a weapon. Because this is almost a perfect story of the struggle between human beings and environment. Not a mountain assault, not a flight into space, but a hidden life inside a steel creature moving through the deep and carrying not simply a crew, but an entire state strategy on its back. Today, a nuclear boat can be a scout, a hunter, a shield, a missile carrier, and an instrument of political pressure all at once. It does not simply fire. It changes the enemy's calculations before the shot is ever taken. And that is why submarines remain such a powerful symbol of force. But the longer we look at them, the clearer one simple thing becomes. The most important element of any submarine is not the reactor, not the torpedo, and not the missile. The most important element is the person who has to live inside that steel darkness and remain human, where everything around seems designed to turn them into one more part of the system. That is where the real drama lies, not in depth by itself, but in the fact that a submarine keeps testing how much endurance, discipline, fear, courage, and inner silence a human being truly possesses. And maybe that is why these stories pull us in so strongly. A submarine looks like a machine, but in reality it tells us far more about people than about metal.